Welcome to this conversation, everyone, about open source and about huge transformation that some tech companies have taken in the last decade or so in that field, and the transformation that I'm hoping that more companies in tech, but also outside of tech, as they move to become more tech companies themselves, will go through. And I'm really honored and really happy to be able to invite here my friend Nithya Ruff, who is the head of the open source program office at Comcast, to share her thoughts on this topic with me. Welcome, Nithya.
Hey, Tobie, thank you so much for inviting me. I'd rather be in Portugal, but this is a good second best.
Yeah, we're going to start this conversation really discussing the fact that, well, every company today is really a tech company in disguise, right? Software is eating the world. And what's interesting to me, and what I don't see a lot of people outside of open source being really fully aware of, is that open source is actually eating software. And so we're really in this place where now pretty much every company that is every large company in the world is really relying on open source software, oftentimes much more than maybe even their executive team is aware of.
Tobie, that's a really good point. We, for example, as Comcast, did not start out as a tech company, but we are using software very, very actively to serve our customers, to improve customer experience, to get to market faster. And open source is the way we are innovating as well. And to your point about adoption, it always starts off as ignoring that open source is even in your organization. Like you said, sometimes you don't know it's there. And then you start acknowledging, you become conscious that it's there, and you then realize that it is beneficial, and people then start consuming more and more open source. And when you consume, you need to comply with open source licenses. You realize that one of the ways of using open source is to make sure that you respect the licenses, but most companies kind of stop there. And really, you need to move past that in order to realize the full benefits of open source, such as contributing back, such as engaging with community, and transforming the culture of the organization.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I really like this this arc that you describe in terms of the journey of a company. What I've seen a lot in my practice is open source programs office tend to be created at the point where a company needs to comply, and so tend to be heavy on the legal aspects. Oftentimes, what you want, as you said, right, is the next step. Because today, if everyone is using open source as part of their stack, it's no longer really a competitive advantage to do so, right? If you really want to benefit and be sort of ahead of the pack, well, it's the next steps that are interesting. And the next steps are really about contributing back and using open source and open source practices to transform the way you work. And in truth, what it is, it's culture, right? It's transforming the culture of your company.
You know, from a business perspective, it sometimes is not obvious. You're saying as a business, our purpose in business is to maximize shareholder profit.
Absolutely.
And revenue and minimize costs, et cetera. And so when you look at contribution, you say, gosh, isn't that giving IP away? Isn't that counterintuitive? Why should I give something away and give someone else an advantage? But when you flip it and say, but I'm also consuming so much software and it's allowing me to reduce cost and get to market faster, and by contributing, I can share the burden of maintaining these changes with the world, then you start realizing that it's actually a good thing to do from a business perspective.
Right, absolutely. There's really interesting research on this topic by the Professor Frank Nagel from the Harvard Business School, who studied, I think, roughly around 60 companies, software companies, that were building and selling software built on top of the Linux kernel. And it turned out that all of the companies that were heavily contributing to the project were actually much better off they were just much more profitable. The benefits were not like 5 or 6% more. These companies were actually twice as efficient in the field. And he explains this by the fact that the software developers in those companies were essentially learning on the job by contributing. And so we're just becoming much better engineers as a result.
Open source development practices, to your point, actually enriches a developer's life. It creates developer happiness. And it's easier to recruit developers when you have a thriving open source practice inside the company. And I think you have some really good examples around that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. When I was at Facebook, when Facebook was a really hot startup just before the IPO, so essentially when it had absolutely no problem hiring engineers, right? I mean, there were thousands of people knocking on the door to get a job. James Pierce, my manager back then, ran a survey on new recruits, and it turned out that even when Facebook was so hot, 75% of new engineering recruits, actually mentioned Facebook's open source program as a key reason for them to join the company.
I think it's remarkable what they've done. A very positive change. We also believe at Comcast, for example, that when you open source your work, new recruits and candidates are actually able to see the quality and the innovation of the work that you do, which then attracts them to work on the project and also tells them, this is the company I want to work with.
One of the examples I often talk about is this European company called Trivago, which is doing hotel bookings, right? And they invested a couple of years ago $100,000 to sponsor an open source project that they were relying on to make sure that it was built in a way that helped them drive their business, essentially. And it was really like a side piece of infrastructure, like nothing like critical from a business perspective. And after a year, not only did they actually get all of what they wanted in terms of like engineering, but the fact they were sponsoring so heavily an open source project made them sort of like this great company to work for. And they had multiple JavaScript developers reach out. And they were like, I think the first year they recruited 4 right away.
That is a fantastic story. I think we all realize that if we are, taking from this open source pool, we need to put back into the pool. Otherwise, it's not sustainable. And the real competitive differentiation comes in how you serve your customers and the UI, et cetera. It's not in the commodity, components that we all want to use in order to build our stacks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a fear of sharing IP, which is frankly very often misguided. Of course, I never suggest to my clients that they should open source key components that are critical to their business. When you don't necessarily have to start by open sourcing your things, you can also just enable your engineers to do small things like upstreaming bug fixes or things like that, right?
Very good point. The on-ramp to contribution can be as small as perhaps documentation. Contributions come in all forms and shapes and sizes, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And thank you for actually bringing that up, because oftentimes people misunderstand the value or diminish the value of non-code contribution to open source, which is frankly as silly in open source as it is in software, right? You don't build software just through engineering. Design is important, branding is important, sales is important.
One of the things we've realized is that open source culture or open source adoption in a company can either start bottoms up or tops down. And I think you've seen some examples in your own journey of both of these types of journeys, right? I have too. So I'd love to hear your examples, and I'll share mine.
The 2 examples that I often talk about, which for me are Very much the opposite is Facebook, which was really driven like a grassroots effort, and that was able to convince the management, the executives of the real business benefits of building such a culture and investing in open source. As soon as React picked up, they started to have multiple benefits out of it. Hiring was the first one. It was obvious really quickly. They found great talent out of it. Microsoft started off with a culture that was anti-open source. And there were famous quotes. Steve Ballmer, Linux is a cancer. The U-turn operated by Microsoft over a decade is fascinating. It's the home of GitHub. It's the home of NPM, right? It's driving so much open source in so many directions. There's always a grassroots culture of open source in a company. But what was really interesting at Microsoft is this is really something that came from Satya Nadella, from the top, where in order to de-silo Microsoft, he really pushed, made the different organizations focused on customers, and essentially said, but the code internally, all of that needs to be shared. So it's kind of like an inner source approach, and that just turned into a huge transformation of the culture of the company.
Satya really made a huge cultural shift inside Microsoft, did he not? So my stories are, I've started OSPOs in 2 companies. The SanDisk, which now is part of Western Digital, a hardware storage company, flash company. I was in the new product division, which was beginning to use a lot of open source. And I was working hard again across the organization to try to convince people to support me in changing the procurement process, the legal process, the recruitment process to support our open source work. And I realized that there were other divisions in the company that were using open source as well. So I convinced our chief strategy officer and our SVP of engineering that we really needed an open source program office in the company. And he agreed. And so we started from a ground up open source program office there.
Fascinating.
In Comcast, we had leadership who was very aware that we needed to use open source and comply with open source and contribute back. So our CTO, Matt Zalesko, was the one who created this role. I jumped at the chance because Comcast is such a broad company. And to be able to touch everything from networking to data centers to embedded devices to mobile, in entertainment and media was fascinating to me. So it was a tops down and also leader driven in the case of Comcast. But I think you bring up a really good point of cultural transformation is hard.
To me, for transformation to work, it has to be two-pronged, right? You have to have executive buy-in, but you also have to have like a grassroots effort. Like it has to be both ways.
For us, it was definitely support from senior leadership was extremely important. Everyone from our president down know what open source is and support open source and fund open source and celebrate it inside the company. And then when I came in, one of the first things I did was to kind of find who the open source enthusiasts were among the engineers, across the company.
And what I think is really important to remember is you can't just change culture, right? You have to enable by lots of different touches this new culture to emerge.
Our community manager, Sheila, created an ambassador program to recognize these enthusiasts and to connect them to each other, to amplify, some of their enthusiasm and energy and successes across the company. And then we really had to work across multiple functions to subtly change the way we did things. For example, how we did communications and PR and marketing in open source is different. Our legal team was already on board, but we had to establish how we work with legal from an open source perspective, and procurement, and how we work with them, and how we work with talent acquisition. And of course, to your point, the middle managers, how do we get them on board so that they allow their engineers room and time to do upstreaming or work with community or do talks in open source. So there are a lot of different touch points that we need to work through.
Absolutely.
And to assure the business and align with the business goals, which is something that you both of us believe is so critical. You need to demonstrate success and align it to how the business is benefiting from the open source work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just want to sort of quickly talk about this because it's so important. And then I would love to hear more about how you feel that this open source work that you've done at Comcast now for a number of years has really transformed the way people work internally, because I think that's absolutely fascinating. You're absolutely right that you have to have alignment, because if with business goals and with what the business is about in your open source practice, because there's been a tendency to sort of think of open source as something that you do for the public good, and it is, right? Like I don't want to, but it has to be both, because if it's not, the minute you're in a situation like we are in right now, right, where suddenly budgets are tightened, the first thing that go right is everything that is not linked to business goals. If you want to have a sustainable effort in open source, one that lasts longer than a fad or when the times are really good, you really have to do that work. If part of your goal is to have like a really agile work in your engineering department, have high velocity in development, then of course upstreaming bugs to make sure that you don't have to maintain like local forks is going to enable this, right? So suddenly you have alignment, and I think that's really important.
It's totally important. Some of the wonderful stories that we've seen, it's definitely helped us break down silos across the company. So we do a lot of inner source work as well. So for example, there were two projects that were doing somewhat similar things. They both opened up their repos and started merging the project so that they do a single project and accept pull requests from outside of their team, which is really unusual in a traditional proprietary environment, right, where everybody has their own repos, which are highly private and nobody contributes to each other. We are using a lot of open source work and contributions in our technical ladder promotions as well. So we are rewarding people for contributions, for working with the Open Source Advisory Council, for being an open source ambassador, to become a distinguished engineer or a fellow. And we are seeing some really good people be promoted, not just because they filed patents, which is important, but also because they did, really good open source work. So I'm seeing better and better software development practices, to be honest with you, more documentation and more thought given to downstream teams that would be using your platform. How would they be onboarded? How do we welcome them into the community? How do we do review? Thinking about governance. And more of our engineers are speaking at conferences, which I think is a fantastic way to share how we are using it, and hopefully someone else can benefit from, what we do.
Well, that's extremely compelling, right? What an amazing success story.
To your point, it does take some time, but the benefits start paying off, and there's a network effect, if you will, of how these things happen. So, so many benefits.
Right.
Yes, it needs culture change, but it can be done.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, frankly, if you can turn around a company like Microsoft, such a huge behemoth with such an anti-open source position at the start, I think pretty much anyone can do it, right? Would you not agree?
Totally agree. And And I think something you said, I believe Satya Nadella said something very profound about the culture change that really sums up our talk this morning.
Yes, I absolutely love this quote. For me, like it really resonates with this. I am extremely impressed by Satya Nadella's leadership in general. I think he's a fantastic leader. He spoke a lot, and he wrote about cultural change at Microsoft. And in his book, he writes the following: because I've made culture change at Microsoft such a high priority, people often ask how it's going. Mm-hmm. Well, I suppose my response is very Eastern. We're making great progress, but we should never be done. It's not a program with a start and an end. It's a way of being. And wow. Yes, right? It's beautiful. And to me, this embraces the philosophy of open source and open source culture in a company more than anything else, really.
Bill said, thank you so much for inviting me to Portugal, but not really taking me to Portugal.
I'm so sorry. I feel bad now.
but really, such a great discussion around the importance of open source adoption by companies, the benefits they get, but to really be okay with the journey, and the cultural transformation takes time, and to be patient with that.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining me. This was fantastic. I'm so glad we could have this conversation.
Yes,
thank you.
We should do it again next time in Lisbon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.